Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something that everyone has wondered at least once, usually at about 3 in the morning, right before deciding whether to risk the long walk to the bathroom in the dark. Asterisk in that question is, how did people, before the luxury of porcelain thrones and flush handles, actually handle, well, bathroom business? Asterisk so, dim the lights, put down your phone, unless you're watching on it, in which case, keep holding it, and just let your brain settle into the idea that for most of human history, using the toilet was neither private, nor hygienic, nor particularly pleasant. Asterisk it was just life asterisk, and sometimes it was life in a ditch. Asterisk. Now, let's float back a little. We'll start way before medieval castles and smelly long before Roman aqueducts or bath. We're talking about CAVEMEN. Yes, those shaggy ancestors you see in textbooks, usually carrying a club and looking vaguely confused. What did they do? Asterisk. Well, they did exactly what you're imagining. They squatted anywhere, behind a rock, in the bushes, downwind if they had the sense for it. Asterisk. Archaeologists like to dress this up by saying early humans had informal latrines. That's just science speak for it. They picked a spot and hoped nobody else used it that day. Asterisk. The thing is, communal living was the default, even back then, and if you've ever been camping with friends, you know the awkward shuffle of realizing somebody else has already claimed your ideal tree. Multiply that by an entire clan of hunter-gatherers. Congratulations. You've just invented the world's first sanitation problem. Asterisk. And this is where early humans got practical. Some sites show evidence of groups designating little waste areas. Basically, proto-toilets, minus the porcelain. These weren't built with plumbing or anything, just patches of ground that everyone agreed, silently or otherwise, yep, that's where the business goes. Asterisk. Of course, animals were an issue. Dogs, wolves, bears. They didn't exactly respect the boundaries of early human hygiene, which means a lot of early bathroom business was probably revisited by the local wildlife. That's a nice image to drift off to, right? A wolf casually trotting away with someone's hard work from earlier that morning. Asterisk. Anyway, let's drift forward a few millennia to ancient civilizations. Because the fun really begins once people stop roaming and start settling. When villages appear, waste appears with them. Imagine 50 huts clustered together, but no sewer system. Pretty soon, you've got waste piling up faster than anyone wants to admit. Asterisk. Some clever communities dug pits, the earliest pit latrines. These were literally just holes in the ground. Simple, effective, but not glamorous. People would cover them with leaves or straw, and when it filled up, well, congratulations, you had a new archaeological layer. Asterisk. Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley took this idea and dressed it up. The Indus Valley civilization, about 4,500 years ago, had what you could generously call bathrooms, little brick cubicles with drains. They weren't flush toilets in the modern sense, but they did allow water to carry waste away, which, frankly, was revolutionary. Asterisk. Of course, away just meant into a ditch, a river, or the nearest street. Still, progress? Asterisk. The Egyptians. They had chamber pots, essentially. Portable toilets that were neither portable nor particularly clean. Picture a clay or wooden bucket lined with sand. You'd squat, do your thing, cover it with a little sand like a conscientious cat, and hope the servant emptied it before the smell ruined your evening of pyramid planning. Asterisk. Mesopotamians went for pits lined with bricks, sometimes with seats, which sounds advanced, until you realize those pits were often inside the house. Imagine dinner with your family, and 5 feet away, you've got the world's least ventilated bathroom. Asterisk. Let's float gently now to ancient Greece. You'd think the birthplace of philosophy would have thought deeply about hygiene, but not really. Public latrines were common, But privacy wasn't. Rows of stone benches with holes cut in them, side by side, no dividers, just you, your neighbor, and a chance to discuss Aristotle while trying not to make eye contact. Asterisk sponges on sticks were provided for cleaning up. Yes, sponges. Shared wands, dipped in vinegar or salt water. Communal toilet paper. Greek edition. Asterisk now. The Romans. Oh, the Romans. They perfected the art of turning even bathrooms into a spectacle. Public latrines could seat dozens of people, beautifully decorated with mosaics, flowing water channels beneath. But again, no privacy. People chatted, conducted business deals, and occasionally gossiped about the emperor, all while sitting shoulder-to-shoulder. Asterisk if you've ever complained about a thin bathroom stall wall. Imagine doing your taxes with 20 strangers staring at the same wall as you. Asterisk, and yes, they too had sponges on sticks, shared, passed around. It makes hand sanitizer seem like the greatest invention in human history, doesn't it? Asterisk so far, we've been gliding through a fairly gross but straightforward story. Humans had waste. They put it somewhere, and they made it slightly fancier over time. But the real chaos, that comes in medieval Europe. Hey guys, so tonight, we're going to drift into a slightly unusual corner of history. Not kings and wars, not battles or treaties. No, we're going to talk about smells. The kind of smells that cling to people, to places, and to centuries themselves. Because, really, what did people smell like in history? Asterisk, it's one of those weird little questions that everyone kind of wonders about, but never asks out loud. We look at glossy portraits of monarchs in velvet and gold, and maybe, just maybe, we forget that behind the powdered wigs and the stiff collars, there was probably a very strong whiff of something less royal. And if you've ever thought medieval castles smelled like lavender and roast meat, well, I hate to break it to you, but they were basically giant stone deodorant-free zones. Asterisk so tonight, dim the lights, settle in, and let's wander through a time when bathing was optional, perfume was mandatory, and people thought fresh air itself could kill you. This won't be dramatic or shocking, just a calm, slow exploration of the sense of the past, gently floating from era to era, with the occasional sarcastic observation to keep things from smelling too serious. Asterisk, let's start at the beginning, or at least, the beginning of people being people. Cavemen, prehistoric humans, the earliest hominids. Now, spoiler, they smelled bad, very bad. There's no polite way around it. No soap, no shampoo, no toothpaste. Just skin, sweat, smoke, and dirt. And that's if they were lucky. If they weren't, you can throw in rotting animal fat smeared on their skin to keep the bugs off. Plus whatever was left clinging from the mammoth they'd wrestled that morning. Asterisk. But here's the thing. It wasn't gross to them. Because everyone smelled. When everyone around you smells like smoke and sweat, it doesn't stand out. It's just the background fragrance of life. A kind of prehistoric cologne called Eau de Mammoth Fire Pit. Very earthy, very musky, with just a hint of rotting berries. Asterisk, and honestly, smoke was probably the dominant smell. Fires were constantly burning inside caves, huts, wherever people lived because fire meant warmth, light, and food. It also meant that everything smelled faintly, or not so faintly, of smoke. Hair, clothing, skin, even the air itself. So if you've ever gone camping and woken up with that lingering campfire smell in your hoodie, congratulations. You now know what caveman couture smelled like. Asterisk now. Let's float forward a little. Ancient civilizations. Egypt, Greece, Rome. Things are starting to improve slightly, because, despite all the pyramids and columns, ancient people were still sweating, farting, and generally being human. The difference is, they had started inventing ways to cover it up. Asterisk, The Egyptians were obsessed with smells, both good and bad. They believed that pleasant fragrances were linked to the gods. Perfume wasn't just vanity, it was spiritual. So what did they do? They basically marinated themselves in oils. Almond oil, myrrh, cinnamon, frankincense. They even made these little cones of scented fat that they'd plop onto their heads, and as the fat melted in the hot sun, it would drip down their hair and skin, releasing perfume as it went, which sounds luxurious, yes, but also vaguely like wearing a stick of butter on your head in 40-degree heat. Asterisk still. It beats smelling like Nile swamp water, and given that Egyptians shaved their heads and wore wigs partly for hygiene, they were actually doing a lot better in the smell department than most civilizations that followed. Asterisk meanwhile, in Greece, the philosophers were debating the meaning of life while smelling faintly of olive oil and gym sweat. Because remember, the Greeks loved athletics. Naked athletics. So picture a stadium full of naked men wrestling in the sun, covered in olive oil. The smell must have been intense, like a mixture of salad dressing, leather sandals, and 3D old gym socks. Asterisk, but hey, at least they bathed. Greek baths were a thing, not daily, but often enough to keep the worst smells at bay. Though, let's be clear, soap, as we know it, didn't exist yet. They'd rub themselves with oil, then scrape it off with a tool called a strigil, taking the dirt and sweat with it. So yes, technically clean, but also slightly oily, slightly sweaty, slightly EAID philosopher. Asterisk, and then we get to Rome. Rome, the land of aqueducts, marble baths, and public toilets that were basically open-air gossip lounges. The Romans had hygiene down to a system. Bathhouses everywhere, soap substitutes, fancy perfumes. They even had scented water fountains at parties. But here's the catch. A bathhouse could hold hundreds of people. Imagine a steamy, echoing hall full of sweating, splashing Romans, people soaking, chatting, probably burping after a heavy meal of garum-fermented fish sauce, which, by the way, reeked. Asterisk, so yes, they bathed, but they also constantly reeked of fish sauce, garlic, wine, and smoke. Not to mention the open sewers running through the streets. Rome smelled glorious and disgusting at the same time. Perfumed patricians walking past piles of garbage, incense mingling with manure. A city of contradictions. Asterisk now. Let's float gently into the Middle Ages, the period most people think of when they picture historical stink. And to be fair, they're not entirely wrong. Castles, towns, villages, let's just say deodorant was not on the medieval shopping list. Asterisk bathing became complicated. The early Middle Ages weren't too bad. People did wash. Bathhouses existed. Monasteries had rules about washing hands and feet. But then came the fear of water. Medical theory in the later medieval period suggested that opening your pores with hot water could let in diseases. So, naturally, the solution was, don't bathe at all. Maybe rinse your hands. Maybe splash your face. But full baths were suspicious, which is how you get 14th century noblemen bragging about only bathing twice a year. Asterisk instead. People relied on linen. Underclothes were washed frequently, absorbing sweat and dirt from the body. Change your shirt, you change your smell at least slightly. Add some dried herbs sewn into your clothing, and voila, instant medieval fabrique. Lavender, rosemary, sage, anything to mask the background odor of hasn't bathed since Easter. Asterisk of course. Castles themselves were smell factories, kitchens roasting meat, dogs and horses stabled inside, rushes on the floor soaked with spilled beer, urine, and whatever else. Even the grandest halls probably smelled like a combination of smoke, wet dog, old ale, and human waste. Glamorous, right? Asterisk peasants weren't much better, living with animals, cooking over smoky fires, rarely washing. But again, everyone smelled. So, To medieval noses, it was normal. What smelled bad to them? Rotting corpses, spoiled food, stagnant water, regular body odor, barely noticeable. And perfumes were everywhere. Nobles loved perfumes, scented gloves, pomanders full of spices, roses, and violets distilled into oils, not because they thought it was fancy, but because it was necessary. If you lived in a castle that doubled as a barn, perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was survival. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We're only just getting started on this long aromatic journey, from prehistoric sweat to medieval lavender sachets. The story of smell is really just the story of humans trying desperately to avoid their own stink. And in the next stretch of our calm little stroll through history, we'll drift into the Renaissance and early modern world where people thought bathing would literally kill them, yet also invented some of the most extravagant perfumes ever made. Spoiler, if you've ever wondered what Louis XIV smelled like, the answer is complicated. So, we've survived the Renaissance and the Baroque with their cloud of perfumes, their lavender sachets, and their suspicious aversion to water. Now, let's float gently into the 18th century, the Enlightenment, a time of reason, science, revolutions, powdered wigs, and finally a slow return to the radical idea that, maybe, just maybe, water wasn't trying to kill you. Bathing started to make a comeback, not daily, not even weekly, but enough that people began to reconsider their relationship with cleanliness. Public bathhouses reappeared in some cities. Wealthy elites had private baths installed in their homes. Doctors started to say, being clean might actually be healthy, revolutionary stuff. Though of course, plenty of people still preferred perfume baths to real baths. Because why risk wetting your pores when you could just drown yourself in eau de cologne? Speaking of which, let's talk about EAI cologne. Invented in Germany in the early 1700s, it was basically the Gatorade of fragrance, a bright citrusy mix of lemon, orange, lavender, and herbs. Light, refreshing, and perfect for dumping on yourself by the gallon. And that's not an exaggeration. People used cologne not just as perfume, but as mouthwash, aftershave, hair rinse, and even medicine. Got a headache? Rub cologne on it. Feeling faint? Drink it. Yes, drink it. Which, considering it was mostly alcohol and herbs, was basically just a very expensive shot of flavored vodka. But while elites were enjoying their scented water and occasional baths, the average city dweller was living in a very different smellscape. Cities in the 18th century were pungent. Open sewers still ran through the streets. Butchers tossed animal guts into gutters. Tanners soaked hides in urine. People dumped chamber pots out windows. And remember, this was also the age of horses. Tens of thousands of them in big cities like London and Paris, producing mountains of manure every day. The streets were thick with it. Historians estimate that by the early 1800s, London's horses alone were dropping something like 1,000 tons of manure daily. Imagine the smell in summer. So yes, perfume was popular, but even perfume couldn't cover the stench of an entire city marinating in human and animal waste. Now, let's waft over to the Enlightenment thinkers themselves. Voltaire, Rousseau, Cantal, those brilliant minds. Did they smell brilliant? Not particularly. Voltaire loved coffee. Rousseau wandered forests in the same outfit for days. Kant followed a strict daily walk schedule, but was not exactly known for sparkling hygiene. They smelled like everyone else. A little sweat, a little smoke, and maybe a spritz of cologne if they were feeling fancy. The age of reason didn't smell any fresher than the age of perfume. But then came the Industrial Revolution, and here's where things got really intense. Factories belching smoke, coal dust coating everything. chemicals in the air, rivers choked with industrial waste. If medieval castles smelled like stables, industrial cities smelled like a coal-fired garbage dump. Manchester, London, Berlin, they were all drowning in smog and sewage. Asterisk workers crowded into tenements with no plumbing. Chamber pots again. Overflowing cesspools. Entire neighborhoods reeking of rot. And disease followed. Cholera outbreaks were directly tied to contaminated water and foul-smelling streets. So yes, bad smells were still killing people, though not because of miasma, but because of bacteria that nobody could see yet. Asterisk, asterisk. And here's the twist. This horror show of industrial stink actually pushed society toward modern hygiene. Soap production skyrocketed in the 19th century. For centuries, soap had been made in small batches and used mostly for laundry. But now, mass production made it cheap and widely available. Suddenly, ordinary people could afford bars of soap, not just the wealthy. Asterisk Victorians, in particular, became obsessed with and with good reason. They were living in cities where coal smoke turned your skin gray, where horse manure piled up on street corners, and where the Thames River in London literally became so foul in 1858 that Parliament had to shut down during what was called the Great Stink. Yes, that was the official name, the Great Stink. Politicians actually fled the building because the smell was unbearable. Asterisk, so what did Victorians do? They doubled down on soap. Soap ads exploded. Soap became a symbol of morality, purity, and respectability. If you were clean, you were civilized. If you were dirty, you were practically a barbarian. The irony, of course, is that the factories making all this soap were also pumping out smoke and sewage that made people filthy in the first place. But at least their laundry smelled like lavender. Asterisk, asterisk. Victorian hygiene routines were intense but still imperfect. Daily bathing wasn't common for everyone, but sponge baths were. People started brushing their teeth with powders. Deodorant didn't exist yet, but perfume bottles were everywhere. And then there was the laundry. The Victorians washed clothes obsessively, especially under white linen, scrubbed and boiled, became the ultimate sign of cleanliness. A crisp, white shirt said, "I am a respectable human who definitely doesn't live next to an open sewer." Asterisk, asterisk. And what about royalty in this era? Did they smell better than their ancestors? Somewhat. Queen Victoria bathed regularly and was fond of floral scents. Prince Albert, her husband, was famously clean and well, but palaces still smelled like palaces. Lots of people, lots of food, lots of candles, and not enough plumbing. Better than Versailles, maybe, but still not exactly fresh as daisies. Asterisk. Meanwhile, ordinary workers smelled of sweat, soot, and factory grease. Farmers smelled of manure and earth. Children smelled like, well, probably like everything they rolled in, which in Victorian streets was not great. Asterisk, asterisk. But here's the big shift. By the end of the 19th century, the idea of daily bathing was slowly taking hold. Plumbing improved. Bathtubs appeared in middle-class homes. Soap companies preached the gospel of cleanliness, and for the first time in history, smelling good wasn't just a luxury, it was becoming an expectation. Asterisk, which brings us to the modern age. But before we drift into the 20th century, with its deodorant sticks, body sprays, and showers on, let's pause and soak in the Victorian dream. A world where coal smoke blackened your lungs. Horse manure filled the streets, and everyone believed that the cure for it all was a bar of lavender soap. So, we've survived the great stink of the Victorians, soot-choked cities, lavender soap mania, and a whole lot of perfume baths. By the end of the 19th century, plumbing was snaking its way into middle-class homes. Bathtubs were becoming fashionable, and the very bold idea of daily bathing was gaining traction. Which means, as we float gently into the 20th century, we finally enter the age where people began to expect, not just hope, that other humans might smell
Tolerable. The biggest game changer. Advertising. Soap companies went from simply selling bars of laundry detergent to selling entire lifestyles. If you scrubbed yourself with Pears soap or Ivory soap, you weren't just clean, you were modern, moral, attractive, and respectable. Ads told people that smelling fresh wasn't optional. It was a duty. Smell bad, and you were basically a social outcast. Smell good, and you were practically royalty. Deodorant also made its grand entrance. The first commercial deodorant, ma'am, appeared in the late 1800s, but it was in the early 1900s that antiperspirants took off, a product called Odorono, short for odor. Oh no, yes, really started convincing women that underarm sweat was not just natural, but disgusting. The ads were ruthless. You may be lovely, but if you offend with perspiration, no one will tell you to your face. Gentle bedtime reminder. Capitalism has always preyed on insecurity. By the 1920s and 30s, deodorant wasn't just a women's product anymore, men were targeted too. Suddenly, sweat wasn't a sign of hard work or masculinity. It was a flaw, a weakness, something to be chemically stopped in its tracks. Humanity had finally declared war on body odor, and the battlefield was the armpit. Meanwhile, the bathroom itself was transforming. Running water, indoor plumbing, and mass-produced soap meant that daily showers became more common, first for the middle class, then eventually for everyone. By mid-century, the morning shower was a cultural ritual, especially in the US. Toothpaste in tubes, shampoo in bottles, shaving cream in cans. It was the age of hygiene convenience. And with cleanliness came scent, layering. Soap first, then deodorant, then aftershave, then perfume. You didn't just wash, you curated an entire aroma portfolio. But let's not pretend the 20th century was a flawless bouquet of roses. Plenty of people still lived in poor housing with no plumbing. Soldiers in trenches during World War I and II smelled like mud, gunpowder, sweat, and fear. Cities were still choked with smog from factories and cars. In many places, people didn't have the luxury of a daily bath until well into the mid-20th century. Still, compared to Versailles or medieval London, the 20th century was practically a scented paradise. Now, one of the funnier chapters in modern smell history is the rise of mass-market fragrances. Companies like Old Spice, Brut, and Axe, or Lynx. If you're British, sold the idea that one spray could make you irresistible, which was optimistic, considering most of those sprays smelled like a citrus-soaked locker room. But the marketing worked. Teenagers drenched themselves in clouds of aerosol body spray, creating new layers of odor that weren't necessarily better than the ones they were hiding. Perfume also shifted. No longer just a way to mask stench, it became about identity. Chanel No. 5, launched in the 1920s, promised sophistication. Calvin Klein in the 80s promised sex appeal. Abercrombie & Fitch in the 2000s promised that your local mall could smell like a nightclub. And through it all, the cultural expectation solidified. If you didn't smell clean, something was wrong with you. By the late 20th century, cleanliness was practically a religion. Commercials showed mothers lovingly scrubbing children with soap. Couples judged each other by breath freshness. Employers expected workers to arrive, showered, shaved, and deodorized. For the first time in human history, smelling like a human, sweaty, smoky, earthy was considered unacceptable. Think about that. For tens of thousands of years, sweat was just life. Smoke was just home. Animals were just part of the family. And then, in the blink of a century, we decided, nope, not anymore. Everyone must smell like synthetic ocean breeze. Now, let's gently float into the 21st century. A world of shower gels with names like Arctic Blast or Cool Rush. Deodorants that promise
72-hour protection, which, honestly, sounds like more of a dare than a feature, and perfumes that can cost as much as a medieval horse. Asterisk, modern humans are, on average, the cleanest smelling in history. Daily showers, fresh laundry, deodorants, shampoos, conditioners, mists, sprays, whole aisles of supermarkets dedicated to making sure nobody ever smells like themselves. Asterisk, and yet ironically people are now circling back. The natural movement has people questioning whether daily showers strip away skin oils. Some skip deodorant entirely. Some embrace musk as authentic. History, it seems, never really ends, it just cycles back in trendier packaging. Asterisk, so what did people really smell like in history? Asterisk, they smelled like smoke and sweat, like garlic and horse manure, like lavender and musk, like soap and cologne. They smelled human. Different centuries layered it differently, but the base note was always the same, people being people. Asterisk. And if you ever feel smug about your citrus body wash and mint toothpaste, just remember, in 200 years, someone will probably look back at us and ask, what on earth was that Axe effect about? Asterisk. Let's drift away from perfume-soaked palaces and lavender-scrubbed Victorian laundries for a moment, and step into a very different kind of smellscape. War. Asterisk. Because while nobles and merchants were worrying about lace collars and scented gloves, armies were producing the kind of aromas that could probably wipe out a perfume factory at 50 paces. Asterisk. Asterisk. Take medieval armies first. Thousands of men marching across muddy roads, leather boots soaked through, armor sweating in the sun, horses snorting and dropping piles behind them. Food was salted meat, onions, and stale bread, so, naturally, everyone reeked of garlic, sweat, and whatever they hadn't washed off in months. Camp followers, women, children, merchants tagged along, cooking and cleaning, which means battle camps weren't just smelly, they were entire moving cities of smoke, animals, waste, and unwashed humanity. Asterisk. And then there's the detail that nobody wants, but everyone wonders. Toilets. Soldiers dug latrines, sure, but discipline varied, which means sometimes camps were more like open sewer with tents. The result? Armies could often be smelled before they were seen. Imagine being a farmer in 14th century France and realizing the faint aroma of garlic, horse manure, and rotting meat on the breeze meant 20,000 men were about to plunder your village. Terrifying, yes, but also unmistakable. Asterisk. Now, Napoleonic armies. Thousands of men in wool uniforms, marching for days, carrying backpacks, eating mostly bread and meat, sleeping in their clothes, bathing, rare, deodorant, non-existent. Napoleon himself allegedly loved cologne, ordered gallons of it from Cologne, Germany, but whether it made a dent in the overall soldier stench is doubtful. Asterisk. British soldiers fighting in Spain during the Peninsula War wrote letters complaining that French troops smelled even worse than they did, which is impressive, because British uniforms were basically wool ovens. The smell of a battlefield wasn't just blood and gunpowder, it was sweat, excrement, rot, leather, and fear. Romantic paintings of cavalry charges never quite capture that bouquet. Asterisk. And then we reach World War I trenches. If you know, you know. But let's spell it out anyway, slowly and gently. The trenches were pits of mud, rats, overflowing latrines, dead bodies, rotting food, unwashed men, wet uniforms, and constant smoke. Soldiers described the smell as indescribable, which is always historian code for horrific. But we don't want to ruin dinner. Asterisk. Letters home often mentioned how unbearable it was. A mix of chlorine gas, wet wool, sweat, and the smell of corpses buried shallow in the trench walls. If perfume was survival in Versailles, here it was cigarettes. Soldiers smoked constantly, partly to calm nerves, partly to mask the smell around them. The Great War wasn't just fought with bullets, It was endured through clouds of cheap tobacco. Asterisk. World War II was little better. Armies were bigger, uniforms slightly more modern, but showers were still rare in the field. Soldiers smelled like grease, smoke, mud, and canned rations. But by then, deodorant had been invented, so soldiers often carried sticks or powders to keep body odor down, at least when supply chains worked. American soldiers, in particular, brought soap and toiletries as part of their kits, which sometimes made them smell fresher than locals in the places they occupied. Cleanliness as soft power, in a way. Asterisk, but the core truth remained: war always smells, and not the heroic kind. Asterisk, now let's float back to peace. Because while soldiers stank their way across continents, ordinary people were also leaving their own scent signatures everywhere. Asterisk. Factory workers in the 19th and early 20th centuries smelled of soot, machine oil, and sweat. Miners reeked of coal dust. Fishermen carried the smell of the sea fish guts, salt, wet ropes. Farmers smelled like animals, earth, and hay. Laundry workers smelled of soap and bleach. Bakers smelled of yeast and flour. Asterisk, every profession had its own aroma, and in an age before everyone was expected to smell like spring rain or cool ocean breeze, those smells were simply part of identity. You could tell what someone did for a living just by standing near them. Asterisk, even royalty, for all their perfume and soap, had their less glamorous scents. Louis XIV, as we mentioned, had his palace of roses and sewage. Queen Elizabeth I probably smelled faintly metallic from her lead makeup. Hey guys, tonight, we're starting something a little bittersweet, a little tragic. And if you happen to be a royal child in medieval Europe, probably inevitable. So, go ahead and dim the lights, settle under the blankets, maybe let the cat curl up at your feet, because tonight's history isn't about crowns and glory. It's about what happened after all that, about the princes and princesses left behind when kings fell off their thrones. Were their heads, asterisk, and the answer, as you might expect, is not happily ever after. Asterisk, because if there's one thing history loved, it was punishing children for the sins of their parents, and if that parent happened to be a dethroned king, then congratulations, your childhood just became a weird mix of exile, imprisonment, forced marriage, or occasionally a suspiciously early death. Asterisk, so let's drift back to a time when dynasties were fragile, alliances were shaky, and kings were constantly being toppled, betrayed, or beheaded. Their children, unfortunately, weren't just kids, they were bargaining chips, potential threats, and awkward reminders of a regime that no one wanted to remember. Asterisk, and sometimes they were just in the way. Asterisk, let's ease into this with a relatively famous example. The Princes in the Tower. Asterisk, Edward V of England and his little brother Richard, Duke of York. Two boys, aged 12 and 9. Their father, King Edward IV, had been a strong monarch of the Wars of the Roses, but he died suddenly in 1483, and as soon as that happened, all the fragile family politics collapsed like a badly stacked Jenga tower. Asterisk, Edward V was supposed to be king, but his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, decided he'd make a much better king himself. So the boys were taken into custody, which sounds very proper, but really meant locked up in the Tower of London. Richard declared them illegitimate, crowned himself Richard III, and the boys quietly disappeared. Asterisk, no one knows exactly what happened. Murdered, neglected to death, smuggled out. The official records don't say, because why bother writing? Oh, by the way, I smothered my nephews last night, but what matters for us tonight is the pattern. Royal children of fallen kings were dangerous. Too dangerous to be left alive, but too royal to just ignore. And so, many of them ended up like these boys, vanishing into history as political inconveniences. Asterisk, and yet, This wasn't even unusual. This was practically standard practice. Asterisk, let's float a little further back in time to Scotland. Kings there had an especially bad habit of dying young, violently, or in the middle of messy feuds, which meant their children often inherited the throne while still wearing training breeches. Take poor James II of Scotland. His father, James I, was assassinated in 1437, stabbed to death by a group of conspirators in front of his queen. His son was only 6 years old. Imagine being 6, and your new title is King of Scots. Not exactly the best start to life. The boy was whisked to Edinburgh Castle and placed under the control of powerful nobles who promptly began fighting over who got to guide him, by which they meant exploit him as a puppet. His childhood was less about toys and tutors, and more about noble factions clawing each other to pieces while using his name. At age 10, he personally witnessed one of his enemies, a noble named William Douglas, being literally stabbed to death in front of him, supposedly with the king's own dagger. James II grew up surrounded by paranoia, fear, and bloodshed, because that's what happened to children of fallen kings. They grew up in cages of politics, where their toys were daggers and their bedtime stories were assassination attempts. Now, not every child of a fallen king got locked away or murdered. Some were exiled, which sounds slightly better, until you realize exile in the 14th or 15th century wasn't exactly a relaxing semester abroad. For example, Henry VI of England. He was deposed, not once but twice, during the Wars of the Roses. His only son, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, spent much of his childhood bouncing between England, Scotland, and France. Never really sure if he'd ever sit on the throne his father kept losing. Edward grew up angry, bitter, and according to some chronicles downright bloodthirsty. At one point, during a quarrel, he allegedly declared he wanted nothing more than to cut off his enemies' heads. Charming child, but considering his father was a weak, mentally unstable king, constantly overthrown, you can understand why his childhood wasn't filled with happy stability. In the end, Edward didn't live to inherit the throne. He was killed at age 17 in the Battle of Tewkesbury. Some sources say he died fighting bravely, others that he was captured and stabbed in cold blood. Either way, his short life shows us what exile and dynastic instability did to royal children. It turned them into pawns, and often, casualties. And let's not forget about the ultimate awkward fate, being married off like a diplomatic chess piece. Royal daughters were especially prone to this. If your father lost his throne, congratulations, you were now a consolation prize, a way for your family to beg mercy by marrying you into the victor's dynasty. Take Catherine of Aragon, later the first wife of Henry VIII. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, but her family nearly lost everything in the tumultuous politics of Iberia. Catherine spent much of her early youth uncertain if her engagement to Arthur Tudor, Henry's older brother, would actually stick. After Arthur died, she was left stranded in England, a widow at age 16, living on scraps while her father refused to pay her dowry. It was humiliating. She, the daughter of one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, reduced to begging the English crown for pocket money. That was the life of many royal girls after their fathers fell, forgotten, shuffled, bargaining chips in marriages no one wanted to pay for. Of course. Sometimes royal children were too important to be killed or married off quietly. In those cases, they were imprisoned for life. Like Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James VI. His mother was forced to abdicate when he was just a baby, and she was locked away in England for the rest of her life. James grew up as king in name, but essentially a hostage of Scottish nobles. His childhood was spent under strict surveillance, his education tightly controlled, his friends carefully chosen for him. Asterisk. Imagine growing up with a crown on your head, but chains around your wrists. That was James VI's life. And while he eventually became James I of England and ruled both kingdoms, his childhood was one long reminder that the child of a fallen monarch was never free. Asterisk. So what's the pattern here? Asterisk. When kings fell, their children rarely had normal lives. They were either killed, imprisoned, exiled, or forced into marriages they didn't choose. Some survived to reclaim thrones, but most faded out footnotes in someone else's reign. Asterisk. The romantic idea of royal childhood, the silk. The Tudors. The castles was often just a fragile bubble. Pop the king at the top, and the whole family fell into chaos. And the children, the supposed heirs, ended up as tragic symbols of lost dynasties. Asterisk. But of course, this is just the beginning. Asterisk. Because we haven't even drifted into the really strange cases yet. The royal kids raised in monasteries. The ones hidden in peasant homes, or the ones who turned up decades later, claiming to be the lost prince. Asterisk. And yes, we're going to float into all of that. Slowly, softly, with just enough sarcasm to make the tragedies bearable. Alright, let's get comfortable again. The lights are dim, the cat is still asleep, and we're gliding deeper into the quiet tragedies of royal children. Because sometimes, being the son or daughter of a fallen king didn't just mean you vanished into the background. Sometimes it meant you stuck around like a very inconvenient ghost, haunting the throne. Asterisk. Let's start with one of history's favorite mystery stories. The boy who might have been Richard, Duke of York. Asterisk. Remember the princes in the tower? The two boys vanished after Richard III locked them up. Well, decades later, a man named Perkin Warbeck popped up in Europe, claiming to be the younger of those two missing princes. He said he'd escaped the tower, fled abroad, and was ready to reclaim his rightful place on the English throne. Asterisk. And the thing is, people actually believed him, not just random villagers, but kings and queens. He had the backing of Margaret of Burgundy, who was, inconveniently, the sister of Edward IV, the real boy's aunt. She swore up and down that Perkin was her nephew. Was she lying? Was she just trolling Henry VII, the Tudor king in power at the time? Probably. But the point is, once you were a child of a fallen king, your identity became so valuable that anyone could claim to be you, and entire wars might erupt over it. Asterisk. Of course, Perkin Warbeck wasn't actually Richard. He was executed in 1499 after being paraded around as a fraud, but his very existence shows how powerful the shadow of royal children could be. Even dead, they refused to go away. Asterisk. And he wasn't the only one. Europe was crawling with so-called lost heirs popping up whenever people felt like overthrowing the king. Asterisk. Take Anastasia Romanov, the daughter of Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. She was executed with her family in 1918 during the Russian Revolution, except maybe she wasn't. Or at least that's what half the 20th century wanted to believe. Asterisk. For decades, women popped up claiming to be Anastasia, insisting they'd escaped the massacre. The most famous was Anna Anderson, a Polish woman who spent years fighting in courts to prove her identity. She convinced many people, including actual members of the Romanov circle, that she was the lost princess. It wasn't until DNA testing in the 1990s that the mystery was finally put to bed. Spoiler, she wasn't Anastasia. Asterisk. But the fact that people wanted so badly to believe she was, shows just how enduring this pattern is. Children of fallen kings became myths. They haunted imaginations centuries after their supposed deaths. Asterisk. Now let's drift back into the medieval period, where the treatment of royal children could be creative, in the most depressing sense. Asterisk. Take John II of France, who was captured during the 100 Years' War and held prisoner in England. To guarantee his ransom, He literally handed over his son, Louis of Anjou, as collateral. Yes, like a pawn ticket at a medieval pawn shop. The kid was shipped off to England to live as a hostage until the king paid up. Spoiler, the king didn't always pay up. Royal kids spent years like this half-prisoner, half-honored guest, growing up in foreign courts that treated them politely, but never let them leave. It wasn't quite chains and dungeons, but it also wasn't freedom. Imagine your childhood spent waiting for your dad to cough up the cash or die trying. Sometimes. Though royal children weren't even held in castles. They were tucked away into monasteries. This was a convenient solution, out of sight, out of mind, but still technically alive. For instance, Henry VI of England spent parts of his childhood not in grand palaces, but essentially cloistered away under heavy guard, given an overly religious education that didn't exactly prepare him for the brutal politics of kingship. He grew up pious, gentle, and completely unfit to rule, which might explain why his reign was one long disaster of defeats and civil war. Putting royal children in monasteries or convents was the medieval way of filing them in the not dead, but not a threat category. You couldn't claim a throne if you'd taken vows of poverty and chastity. Well, technically you could, but it was a harder sell. And then we get to the really bleak ones. The children who were kept under house arrest, sometimes for their entire lives. Let's look at Joan of England, the daughter of Edward II. When her father was overthrown, she was married off to David II of Scotland. Sounds like a normal royal marriage, except that David was captured during a battle and spent years as a prisoner in England. Joan, meanwhile, lived most of her adult life in practical isolation, childless, lonely, and forgotten. Her father's fall left her trapped in a political limbo she never escaped. Or take Edward, son of Henry VI again, that 17-year-old who died in battle. Imagine him. All he knew was exile, waiting, plotting, watching his father lose the throne over and over. He never got a chance at adulthood. His whole life was just a prelude to someone else's reign. And while we're floating in this direction, let's touch on one of the strangest patterns of all. The children who were raised by their enemies. This happened more often than you'd think. If a king was dethroned, sometimes the new ruler would scoop up the royal children and raise them like pets. On the surface, this looked merciful. In reality, it was insurance. Raise the kid under your thumb, make them dependent on you, and they'll never rise against you. The Ottomans perfected this system. They would take royal children from conquered territories, raise them in the Sultan's court, and turn them into loyal servants of the empire. For some kids, this meant luxurious lives as courtiers. For others, it meant lifelong pawns. Either way, it erased their original identity. Europeans did it too. Henry VII raised the daughters of Yorkist nobles in his court, making sure they grew up loyal to the Tudor regime. Keep your enemies close, as the saying goes. Or, in this case, keep their children in your guest room. So by now, you can see the picture forming. When kings fell, their children didn't just lose a father. They lost their futures. They were exiled, married off, imprisoned, or remade into someone else's tools. Some became myths, like the princes in the tower. Others became pawns, like John II's hostaged son. And some were just forgotten. It's one of the bitter ironies of monarchy. The children who were supposed to embody dynastic continuity, the hope of tomorrow, ended up as victims of yesterday's politics. But we're not done. Oh no. Because we still haven't drifted into the most fragile, the most doomed category of all. The royal children who actually inherited their fallen father's throne. You'd think this might be a win. Congratulations. Your father's dead. Here's a crown. But no. Being a child king was less a gift and more a curse. And in part 3, we're going to slowly, softly, and somewhat sarcastically explore the sad parade of child monarchs who spent their reigns as pets, and so someone stronger inevitably shoved them aside. Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something that everyone in history cared about, but rarely admitted out loud. Looking good. Asterisk now. When we say beauty hacks, you might imagine YouTube tutorials with soft lighting, cheerful music, and someone telling you how to contour your face in under 5 minutes. Medieval Europe didn't have that. What they did have was a lot of time, a lot of weird ideas, and a worrying amount of poisonous powders. Asterisk. So let's dim the lights, settle back under the blankets, and take a slow drift into the world of medieval beauty, where glowing skin usually meant chalk white, with a hint of lead. Poisoning and natural remedies often included things scraped off barn animals, because of course they did. Asterisk first, let's start with what actually worked. Because yes, medieval people weren't total fools. They noticed that certain herbs softened skin, or that certain oils added shine to hair. They just couldn't resist doubling down with some less than safe experiments on top. Asterisk. Take rosewater, for example. Simple, effective, and still sold today. Medieval women used it as a toner, splashing it on their faces after washing. It smelled nice, it tightened skin slightly, and it made them feel refreshed. That's a medieval beauty hack you could actually still use, without ending up in the emergency room. Asterisk. Another safe one. Honey masks. Honey is naturally antibacterial, and medieval women, especially in monastic settings, used it to heal blemishes and soothe the skin, and it worked. Plus, if you got hungry during your skincare routine, well, snack time was already on your face. Practical. Asterisk. And then there's egg whites. Applied as a face mask, they dried quickly, tightening the skin and giving the illusion of smoothness. It was basically a medieval Instagram filter, except you had to smell faintly like breakfast while wearing it. Asterisk. So far, so good. Gentle, natural, effective. Asterisk. But this is medieval history, so naturally, we need to ruin it. Asterisk. Because for every safe and soothing hack, there were at least 3 more that could kill you, blind you, or leave you with permanent nerve damage. And people used them anyway, because beauty was never about health. It was about showing off your social class, even if it meant slowly poisoning yourself for the sake of fashion. Asterisk. Let's glide into the most famous culprit, lead. Asterisk. Lead-based powders were everywhere. Women wanted pale, ghostly skin, because tan skin meant you worked outdoors. Pale skin meant you were rich enough to sit inside and do absolutely nothing, which, ironically, is still the dream for a lot of us. The problem was, the best way to get that bone-white look was with Cerussa lead carbonate paste. Asterisk. It looked good, it went on smooth, and it slowly poisoned you. Lead absorbed into the skin, causing muscle weakness, headaches, hair loss, and eventually death. But hey, at least you looked flawless in the meantime. Elizabeth I of England used lead-based makeup so often that by the end of her life, her skin was ruined, which of course meant she just put on more lead makeup to cover it up, because why not double down? Asterisk. Next up, let's talk about mercury. Yes, the shiny liquid metal you're not supposed to touch. Medieval alchemists thought it had magical purifying properties, so naturally, it ended up in skincare. Women used mercury-based ointments to fade blemishes or lighten their complexions. Spoiler, it did lighten your skin because it was killing your cells. It also caused tremors, kidney failure, and insanity. So yes, mercury cleared your acne, along with most of your brain cells. Asterisk. But let's float back to some less lethal hacks, because not every medieval beauty trick was a death sentence. Asterisk. For hair care, medieval women used vinegar rinses. This gave hair shine, helped with dandruff, and made locks smooth. If you've ever used apple cider vinegar in your hair, congratulations, you've just recreated a 14th century beauty routine. The downside? You smelled like salad dressing, but at least you weren't dead. Asterisk another favorite was henna. Imported from the Middle East, it was used to dye hair, and sometimes nails a rich reddish orange. Safe, natural, and fashionable. In fact, it was so beloved that European women who couldn't afford real henna tried to fake the look with homemade mixtures, which often didn't turn out quite as elegant. Imagine walking around with streaky carrot-colored hair and insisting it was intentional. Some things never change. Asterisk now. Of course, beauty wasn't just about skin and hair. It was about eyebrows. Asterisk and medieval eyebrows had quite the journey. In the early Middle Ages, bushy brows were fine. But by the later medieval and Renaissance period, fashion demanded a very high forehead and almost invisible eyebrows, which meant women plucked their brows within an inch of their lives, and sometimes shaved back their hairlines too. Yes, having a giant forehead was considered beautiful. Entire foreheads gleaming like pale moons, unbroken by pesky brows. Asterisk so, medieval hack. Shave your eyebrows and rub ashes or walnut oil into the skin to stop regrowth. Did it work? Sort of. Did it also make you smell faintly like burnt wood? Absolutely. Asterisk now. Let's glide into one of my personal favorites, belladonna drops. Asterisk belladonna, or deadly nightshade, was used as an eye drop. Why? Because it dilated the pupils, making eyes look bigger and supposedly more alluring. Think of it as the medieval version of Snapchat filters. The problem is, belladonna is extremely toxic. It caused blurry vision, dizziness, and sometimes permanent blindness. Women literally risked their eyesight so men would say, "Wow, her eyes look nice tonight." Romance. Asterisk, of course. Medieval men had their own beauty hacks too. They weren't immune to the vanity trap. Knights and nobles wanted smooth skin, glossy beards, and most importantly fresh breath. Asterisk for that. They chewed herbs like parsley, fennel seeds, or cloves. Effective, natural, and still recommended today. But others used tooth powders made of crushed coral, burnt eggshells, or even ground up bones mixed with vinegar. Did it clean their teeth? Yes. Did it also erode their enamel into oblivion? Also, yes. Congratulations. You now have very white teeth that will fall out by age 30. Asterisk so, by now, you can see the pattern forming. Medieval beauty was a spectrum. On one end, rosewater, honey, vinegar, herbs gentle, effective, and still surprisingly modern. On the other end, lead, mercury, arsenic, and poisonous plants, things that looked good in the short term and destroyed you in the long run. Asterisk, and the worst part, people knew some of these things were dangerous. They noticed their skin rotting, their hair falling out, their eyesight blurring, and yet they kept using them, because beauty was status, beauty was survival. If looking fashionable meant cutting your lifespan in half, well, that was a sacrifice worth making. Asterisk, but this is just the beginning. Because we haven't even talked about the stranger hacks yet. The ones involving pigeon droppings, frog spawn, or rubbing raw meat on your cheeks for that perfect blush. Yes, those are real. And yes, we're going to float into them. Asterisk, so go ahead. Pull the blanket a little higher, because in part 2, we're drifting deeper into the medieval beauty cabinet. And trust me, it's going to get weird. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. Not kings, not queens, not even inbred dynasties or tragic royal toddlers. Instead, we're going to drift back into the workday grind of the ancient world. Because as much as we love to imagine ancient civilizations as pyramids, marble statues, and epic battles, most people weren't chiseling monuments or leading armies. Asterisk, they were working. They had jobs. Jobs that ranged from the mildly bizarre to the flat-out unpleasant. Jobs so forgotten that you won't find them in most history textbooks. Because, let's be honest, nobody wants to spend 10 pages describing the man in Babylon who was paid to collect broken pottery shards. Asterisk. But that's where we're headed tonight. The background characters of history, the ordinary, the strange, and the slightly smelly professions that kept the ancient world running. Asterisk. So, let's slip slowly back into Mesopotamia first, because why not start with the cradle of civilization, where writing was invented, partly so people could keep track of beer rations for workers. Priorities, asterisk, asterisk, the beer monitors of Mesopotamia, asterisk, yes, beer. In Sumerian cities like Uruk, workers were often paid in barley beer, which means someone's actual job was to measure, record, and hand out daily beer portions. Imagine training for years to learn cuneiform writing, carving little wedge-shaped signs into clay tablets, only to spend your days logging 3 jars for brick, 2 jars for reed cutter, half a jar for guy who fed the goats. Asterisk, that was your night. Well, sunrise to sunset. There was no weekend. The Sumerians invented bureaucracy, and beer ration scribes were basically its frontline workers. And yes, those same scribes sometimes cheated. Archaeologists have found tablets with disputes about missing rations. So, it seems workplace drama is also as old as civilization itself. Asterisk, asterisk, the ostrich feather fan bearers of Egypt, asterisk. Now, let's float down the Nile, where Egypt had some of the strangest court jobs in history. Among my favorites, the fan bearers, asterisk. Imagine being hired not to build pyramids, not to carve statues of gods, but to follow the pharaoh around holding a massive ostrich feather fan. Your job was to keep him cool, to swat away flies, and of course to look glamorous while doing it. Asterisk, and this wasn't just a servant's role. Fan bearer on the king's right hand was actually a prestigious court title, often given to nobles, which means someone who could have been managing estates or commanding soldiers instead spent their career walking backwards, wafting air at the divine ruler and hoping not to drop the fan. Asterisk, did it work? Maybe a little. Did it look impressive? Absolutely. Egyptians' new aesthetics were half the job description. Asterisk. Asterisk. The Roman urine collectors, asterisk. Now let's glide to Rome, the empire of roads, aqueducts, gladiators, and urine. Asterisk. Yes, ancient Romans used urine in tanning leather and cleaning clothes, because urine contains ammonia, which is a natural cleanser, which meant someone had to collect it. And that job went to you, guessed it, professional urine collectors. Asterisk. They set out jars in public places where people could relieve themselves, then hauled the liquid gold, so to speak, back to laundries and tanneries. The Emperor Vespasian even put a tax on it, known as the vectigul urine, which is how we got the old Latin saying, pecunia non alit, money doesn't stink. Asterisk. Spoiler, it did stink. Very much. But if you were a Roman launderer, you accepted it. Clothes were washed by stomping them in tubs of water, urine, and clay. Imagine being the poor apprentice stuck with foot duty. Probably not the glorious Roman career path your mother envisioned. Asterisk. Asterisk. The goose pluckers of Greece. Asterisk. Meanwhile, in ancient Greece, beauty came at a price. Smooth skin was prized, especially for women and young men. But razors weren't exactly Gillette quality, which is why Athens had a professional class of goose pluckers. Asterisk. Their job was to pluck feathers from geese, and then use the warm, oily down to strip hair from human bodies. Think of it as ancient waxing, except instead of a nice salon with relaxing music, you got a goose handler yanking out feathers and rubbing them on your skin. Effective. Maybe. Dignified. Not really. Asterisk. The good news. If you were a goose plucker, you also supplied pillows. The bad news. Nobody looked at you without thinking about goose smell. Asterisk. Asterisk. The soundtrack of forgotten jobs. Asterisk. So, if we pause here for a second, let's notice a pattern. Forgotten jobs weren't glamorous. They were repetitive, weirdly specific, and often disgusting. Beer measurers, urine collectors, goose pluck, fan wavers, and yet, without them, daily life in these great civilizations would have fallen apart. Asterisk pharaohs would have sweated. Romans would have worn dirty tunics. Sumerians would have rioted over unpaid beer, and the Greek elite would have been hairier than they preferred. Asterisk history loves its kings and battles, but it was really carried on the shoulders of people whose job descriptions could double as comedy sketches. Asterisk, asterisk, and we've only just started, because there are still the perfume makers of Babylon, the lice pickers of medieval courts, the fire watchers of Rome, and the professional mourners who were literally paid to cry at funerals. Asterisk, but we'll save those for the next part. Asterisk, so, close your eyes. Imagine the sound of clay tablets being scratched, feathers wafting in the hot sun, and the slosh of Roman laundries. These were the forgotten workers, shaping civilizations one weird task at a time. So, we've met the fan bearers, the beer counters, and the Roman urine collectors. Glorious. But let's drift now into the kinds of jobs that weren't about building things or cleaning things, but about social performance. Jobs that existed because people, for some reason, wanted them to. Asterisk, and few jobs captured that better than the professional mourner. Asterisk, asterisk, the hired grievers. Asterisk, imagine you die in ancient Egypt, or ancient Rome, or, really, most places before the modern age. Your family is supposed to make a big show of grief at your funeral, crying, wailing, tearing their clothes, proof that you were deeply loved and respected. Asterisk, but here's the problem. What if your family wasn't very emotional? Or what if, frankly, you weren't that likable? Enter the professional mourners. Asterisk, these were people, usually women, who were literally paid to cry at funerals. The louder, the better. They scratched their faces, pulled their hair, threw dust on themselves. Sometimes they even sang dirges or shouted the names of the dead. Asterisk, in Egypt, they went one step further. Some mourners were hired to impersonate the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, the divine sisters who wept for Osiris. They painted themselves, wore specific wigs, and acted out ritual grief. So if you died rich enough, your funeral came with not just mourners, but cosplayers of gods, screaming your praises. Asterisk, Rome had them to prefecate, who would show up, cry dramatically, and then move on to the next client. Think of it as a subscription service for sadness. Asterisk, was it sincere? No. Was it effective? Definitely, because if your funeral was noisy, it proved you were important. Which means that sometimes, the most successful mourner wasn't the one who actually cared, but the one with the best set of lungs. Asterisk, asterisk, the lice pickers of royal courts. Asterisk now. Let's drift to medieval and early modern courts, where royalty had servants for everything including parasites. Asterisk, yes, professional lice pickers. Asterisk, even the most glamorous nobles were crawling with little passengers. Hygiene wasn't great, wigs were sweaty, and layers of velvet weren't exactly breathable, which meant lice. Lots of lice. Asterisk, but did the kings and queens of Europe pick their own? Of course not. That was the job of a servant, often a trusted one. They would sit quietly, parting the royal hair, removing lice, and crushing them. And in some cases, it was even considered intimate. Accounts exist of queens letting favored ladies-in-waiting pick lice from their scalps, almost as a bonding activity. Imagine court gossip combined with parasite removal. Asterisk. There are even stories of French and Spanish monarchs letting close companions search through their wigs while chatting about politics, which means that some of the great decisions of history were probably made while someone was flicking bugs into a bowl. Asterisk. Asterisk, the public criers. Asterisk next. We have the original news anchors, the town criers. Asterisk, in medieval cities, literacy wasn't widespread. Newspapers didn't exist, but people still needed to know the news. New taxes, lost livestock, upcoming executions, royal decrees. Enter the town crier. Asterisk dressed in bright livery, with a big bell. They shouted announcements in the market square. Here though wasn't just a cliche. It was literally how they grabbed attention. And they weren't just shouting random things. Town criers had legal authority. What they said was considered official. Binding news. Asterisk. So imagine a man with questionable dental hygiene, bellowing in the rain about the price of grain or the latest plague regulations. That was your CNN. And yes, criers were sometimes attacked if the news was unpopular, which means shouting taxes have increased in the middle of a hungry crowd wasn't exactly a safe gig. Asterisk. Asterisk the food tasters. Asterisk. Now, let's glide into something both prestigious and terrifying. The royal food taster. Asterisk. If you worked in a medieval or Renaissance court, one of the most honored jobs was tasting the king's food before he ate it. The logic was simple. If it was poisoned, you dropped dead first. If you survived, congratulations, the king could eat safely. Asterisk on paper, it sounds awful. But in practice, food tasters were often well rewarded and trusted. After all, they were constantly close to the ruler. They dined at the royal table, albeit nervously, and sometimes became confidants. Of course, every bite was a gamble. Asterisk historians debate how effective this really was. Slow-acting poisons wouldn't show symptoms right away, so tasting only helped with fast, dramatic poisons. Still, kings liked the theater of it, because nothing says I'm important like making another human guinea pig your daily appetizer. Asterisk, asterisk. The court dwarfs and entertainers. Asterisk. We also can't forget the official entertainers. From jesters to musicians to dwarfs. Royal households loved to keep people around who were amusing simply by existing. Asterisk court jesters weren't just clowns. They had a license to mock kings, point out hypocrisy, and make crude jokes. Sometimes they were the only ones who could say what everyone else was thinking, safely hidden under the mask of comedy. Asterisk court dwarfs, on the other hand, were treated less as people and more as exotic curiosities. They were dressed in elaborate costumes, given nicknames, and trotted out for amusement at feasts. Some became beloved companions. Others were treated appallingly. Either way, being born unusually short could land you a permanent role at court, whether you wanted it or not. Asterisk, asterisk, the night watch, asterisk, and finally, let's wander out into the streets. Medieval cities weren't exactly safe at night. Fires, thieves, drunken brawls, it was chaos, which is why towns employed night watchmen. Asterisk their job, walk the streets, carry a lantern, rattle a stick, and announce the hours. 2 o'clock, and all's well. Spoiler, all was not well, but the ritual was comforting. Asterisk night watchmen weren't exactly elite law enforcement. They were often old, half-blind, or too poor to get out of it. Many were drunk themselves, but in theory, they kept the peace. In practice, they mostly added background noise to the city nightscape. Still, someone had to do it. Asterisk, asterisk. So if we pause here, we've now drifted through mourners, parasite pickers, criers, tasters, jesters, and watchmen. Jobs that were less about building civilizations and more about managing feelings, grief, fear, boredom, insecurity. Asterisk civilizations weren't just bricks and bread. They were rituals, anxieties, and the human need to have someone else take care of awkward tasks. Whether that was crying at your funeral, picking bugs from your wig, or risking death for your dinner. Asterisk, and next, we'll keep floating into the jobs that sound even stranger, like official stink removers, ancient perfumers, medieval executioners, and the people who cleaned out castle latrines.